When I joined GitLab back in 2016, I learned a lot from their current CEO, Sid, at the time around sustainability. And if you have this shared ownership in your people organization, it goes a long way when you do things like headcount planning.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Unlocking Growth Show, the podcast where we help businesses unlock the next level of growth. I'm your host, Gary, CEO and co-founder of Whale.
Hi everyone, we've got Nadia on the show today. Welcome, Nadia. You're going to talk about budget and how it relates to people in a business. Let's dive right in. Could you share a little bit about what you feel is the relationship between budgets and people, which is not something a lot of companies, I think, look at together, but I'd love to get started there and understand your vision on it.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Good to be here. Thanks for having me. When I joined GitLab back in 2016, I learned a lot from their current CEO, Sid, at the time around sustainability. And if you have this shared ownership in your people organization, it goes a long way when you do things like headcount planning, when you think about the difference between what your headcount and operational costs are. The sooner you do it, it might feel like this tedious task and way too early at any company, Series A, whether it's a startup or a small entrepreneurship or whatever the case may be, right? I think it makes sense to do it early on because if you have this real check on how things are going between operational budgets and headcount budgets, you often come to find that you might have multiple vendors doing the same thing, or you might have too much cost in a certain area of a business. I like the idea as well of tying headcount and headcount planning to budgets. I think it's a great way to safeguard an organization to not run into a year later or 2 years later into Series B or C layoffs. I mentioned this to you earlier in a quick conversation that very often when organizations wait too long to start getting their head of people or VP of people on board, or even like the head of talent, right, on board with how budgets work in the organization and how you can tie that back to headcount and planning for hiring, all of a sudden it becomes very real about the amount of people you add and that cost that it's going to add to the business. So I think it's just an amazing way to partner with the organization. The role of people teams have changed. This is no longer an HR admin function. This is also no longer just an operational function. There's a very strategic relationship between a head of people and a CEO or a COO. And the quicker that alignment forms, it also means that buy-in into what budgets are for and how it protects your annual reoccurring revenue or CAR, like depending which method you follow. If your head of people or your VP of people or director of people or whatever follows that same alignment in achieving that, you're all working towards the same goal. You're ultimately working towards whether that's profitability or IPO or whatever that outcome is that you're looking for long term.
Do you feel like we obviously went or are going through an economic downturn? We've seen massive layoffs across the board, medium to large businesses. Do you feel like in events like we're going through, does budgeting at all allow you to navigate those difficult waters, or what kind of role does budget plays when things like today are happening?
The role of FP&A, so financial planning, is so underrated in the world of startup, in my opinion. If you think about even navigating a layoff or working or thinking about one as a CEO, let's say we have a CEO that has a company of 500 people, worried about the headcount cost currently and already considering that. Doing an analysis of what that layoff is going to cost, especially in a distributed team, might change his mind in whether going ahead with that layoff, especially if there's future critical skills he wants to hire for. And so you could really lean on your FP&A team or having someone in financial planning and finance in general that looks after that clear planning and analysis of what something is going to cost. I find in distributed companies, layoffs are really expensive. And instead, I would actually lean on into a product like I'm working for now, doing that competencies and skills-based assessment to check what is it that you have at the company that can do those critical skills anyway. And so first doing that skills and competency-based match before layoff is not only going to save a ton of heartache, but it will change the future hiring. There will be less hiring. So you're doing the right thing in terms of laying off at that time then, but you're also protecting the company from understanding the budget and what it's going to take to go through these very difficult decisions. So I think that's the one thing. But I think FP&A in general is underrated in the world of headcount planning. I have so many times seen these small companies grow from, I don't know, 50 people to 1,000 people over 3, 4, 5 years, and then going through that hyper growth phase, not knowing what is costing you what and what you're
Mm.
hiring for can be quite dangerous. And it's just this like growth at all costs. So I think part of this economy downturn is now a lot of companies paying school fees for that growth at all costs instead of really focusing early on meaningful growth, understanding what things cost in their
Mm.
world of operations and headcount.
Let's say you're a business, you're a couple of years in, your revenue is a couple of millions, but you've not really paid a lot of attention to financial planning and budgeting around like headcount. What would you advise to be like some of the variables that they need to take into considerations? Like what are typically some of the costs to look at into what are the top 5, top 10 things you would always put in a sheet, if you will?
I would start with headcount and separate it from OpEx. So have your headcount budgets separate from OpEx. Obviously, they roll up into the same total annual budget, but figuring out what your headcount costs is going to be an awakening in itself. You can then easily start doing what is an average cost per employee. Knowing that number is important, right? If that is exceptionally high, you might want to have a meaningful way to bring that more efficient in